They called it paterfamilias, the law of the father. In ancient Rome, it wasn't just a social norm, it was written into the bones of their legal system. The father or the husband ruled over his household with a power so absolute that it could decide between life and death. And yes, that meant his wife. Picture a crowded Roman forum at midday, merchants shouting prices, slaves rushing with baskets of figs, children running between marble columns. Then the crowd falls silent as a man drags his wife into the open square, her hair tangled, her tunic torn, her face streaked with tears. He doesn't need to whisper to the magistrate or ask permission from the Senate or prove anything to a judge. The law has already handed him the right to decide her fate. This wasn't just private drama. This was Roman justice playing out for all to see. And the chilling part, people didn't just accept it, they applauded. Under Roman law, a husband could legally kill his wife if she committed adultery, drank wine without his permission, or, in some cases, simply disobeyed him. The ancient writers even recount stories where neighbors were invited to watch, turning execution into a kind of grim public spectacle. The woman's body became the stage where the values of Rome were reinforced: loyalty, chastity, obedience. And her death was a warning to every other wife in the crowd. But this power wasn't just about morality. It was about control. Marriage in Rome was never just a romantic bond. It was a transaction, a political alliance between families. The wife carried not only children, but honor, and honor was worth more than gold. If she betrayed that, even with a rumor, her blood could cleanse the stain on the family name. Imagine the terror this created for Roman women. Every glance from another man could be seen as suspicion. Every whisper could turn deadly. And even if the wife was innocent, her husband's word carried more weight than hers ever could. It wasn't a trial, it was a sentence. And the husbands knew this power kept their world in order. Roman writers like Cato the Elder boasted about using violence to keep wives obedient. He even wrote that if a wife was caught drinking wine, which Romans believed could lead to immoral behavior, the husband should kill her on the spot. This wasn't some rare, forgotten custom. This was the cornerstone of Roman domestic law for centuries. And yet, historians say the most terrifying part is how normal it became. Wives lived under constant surveillance, their bodies policed not by strangers, but by the men they slept next to each night. But here's where the story gets even darker. There were cases where this law was abused, where husbands killed their wives, not for adultery but for greed, to marry a richer woman to claim her dowry, or simply because they could. Rome allowed it, so long as the husband could stand before his neighbors and say he had just cause. And if you think this sounds like the madness of a single era, wait until you hear how this law evolved, and how it turned entire neighborhoods into witnesses, enforcers, and sometimes executioners of the women who defied Rome's marital code. The law itself was deceptively simple. It didn't read like a dramatic proclamation. No thunder, no divine warning. It was just a line in the 12 tables, Rome's earliest set of laws. A husband may kill his wife if she is caught in adultery, and he may do so without trial. In a world where words carved in stone defined the boundaries of life, this one cold sentence carried the weight of a sword. What made it worse was how this power spread beyond the husband. Fathers could do the same. If a daughter was caught in adultery, he had the right to kill her, even if she was already married. In some cases, the father and the husband would meet to decide whether the wife should live or die. It was as if the woman's life was a coin to be flipped between two men, her own opinion irrelevant. Historians tell us that this was not just rare, dramatic theater. It happened often enough that it shaped the very psychology of Roman women. They were trained from childhood that their chastity was not theirs to guard. It belonged to the family, and violating it was not just a sin, but a crime against the state. And when the punishment came, it was designed to humiliate as much as it was to kill. In some cases, the wife would be stripped, bound, and dragged through the streets before the execution. This wasn't just about death. It was about showing everyone what happens when a woman dares to challenge the hierarchy of Rome. Even the method of execution mattered. While some husbands chose to kill privately, others preferred the public spectacle. One account describes a husband who beat his wife to death with a club in the middle of the forum, while the crowd stood in silence, not out of pity, but out of respect for the law. When he was done, they congratulated him. To them, it wasn't a murder. It was justice. This public approval was crucial. The law didn't require a judge, but it did require that the husband show just cause. That meant inviting neighbors to witness the act, to nod and agree that the wife deserved her fate. Imagine the horror of standing in the center of your own street, surrounded by people you know, as they silently agree that you should die. And yet, there were women who resisted. Roman history is filled with stories of wives who fought back, poisoning their husbands, plotting escapes, even forming secret cults dedicated to freedom from male control. Each time these plots were discovered, Rome reacted with brutal crackdowns, executing dozens, sometimes hundreds of women at once, to remind everyone that no one was above the law of the father. Over time, this system created a chilling effect. Women lived not just in fear of their husbands, but in fear of being seen. A rumor could be fatal. A jealous neighbor, a rival lover, a vengeful slave, any of them could accuse a woman of infidelity, and her husband could use that as his justification. But here's the twist. This wasn't just about morality or control. It was also about politics. Powerful men used the deaths of their wives as public statements, showing that their household was pure, loyal, and Roman to its core. And in a society obsessed with honor, a man who did not punish a disobedient wife could be mocked for weakness. This wasn't a private matter. It was a performance, and the more public, the better. Roman moralists wrote proudly about these acts, praising the husbands who defended the sanctity of marriage. The applause wasn't just metaphorical. In some cases, the crowd literally cheered. But if this law was so absolute, so deeply ingrained, you might wonder, what happened when the husband was wrong? When the accusation was false? When the wife was innocent? That is where the story turns from cruel to tragic, because even then, Rome sided with the husband. And the cost of that injustice would echo for generations. One of the most infamous cases came from the early days of the Republic. The story is of Spurius Carvilius Ruga, a man celebrated for divorcing his wife, not because she had betrayed him, but because she was barren. Roman society applauded him for it. This wasn't just a man choosing a different partner. This was Rome declaring that a woman's worth began and ended with what she could give to the state, children. Her inability to produce them was treated like treason. But there were darker stories, the kind Rome didn't like to brag about but could never quite erase. One such story involves a noblewoman accused of adultery by her husband. She swore her innocence, but he summoned witnesses, neighbors, even slaves to testify against her. When the moment came, she was executed without trial. Years later, those witnesses admitted they had lied, pressured by the husband who wanted her dead so he could marry someone else. No one punished him. In fact, some praised him for acting in accordance with the law. The philosopher Seneca once wrote that Roman men did not love their wives, they ruled them. He said the law turned the wife into a perpetual defendant, always living under the shadow of judgment. To modern ears, this sounds like exaggeration, but the legal records tell the truth. A husband could not be charged with murder for killing an adulterous wife. It wasn't even considered a crime. This legal immunity gave rise to horror stories. There were cases where men lured their wives into traps, catching them in situations they could claim were suspicious, just to justify the killing. Imagine the terror of a woman who knew that every gesture, every glance at another man, could be twisted into evidence against her. And this fear wasn't confined to Rome's elite. Even poor households enforced the same rules, sometimes with even more brutality. Archaeologists have found skeletons of women buried hastily, with signs of blunt force trauma, their skulls crushed. Inscriptions nearby sometimes name the husband and declare that the death was just. It wasn't hidden, it was displayed as a warning to others. Yet, there were moments when Rome's cruelty went too far, even for Rome. One of the most shocking crackdowns happened in 331 BCE, when a plague struck the city, and someone accused a group of women of secretly poisoning the men. Dozens of women were rounded up, tortured, and executed. The historian Livy writes that the women were forced to drink the supposed poison themselves as proof of guilt. And when they died, it was treated as a confession. But later, it was discovered that there had been no poison at all. The mass execution had been a paranoid overreaction. Even when these miscarriages of justice came to light, there was rarely reform. Rome's leaders believed fear kept society stable. Better that a few innocent women die, they said, than that others believe they could escape their duty. And perhaps the most chilling part is that the women themselves sometimes accepted this fate. Roman writers describe wives who calmly submitted to death, believing it was better to die with honor than to live in shame. That is the level of psychological control this law had. It made victims complicit in their own destruction. All of this paints a picture of a society where marriage was not a sanctuary, but a cage, where the man was both husband and executioner, and the wife could never be sure when the hand that once held hers would become the hand that struck her down. But this story doesn't end here. Rome's obsession with controlling women would escalate even further. As the empire grew richer and more decadent, the punishments became more elaborate and more sadistic. The next part of this story takes us into a world of public humiliation, ritualized torture, and executions designed not just to punish but to entertain. As Rome expanded, so too did its appetite for cruelty. The early Republic's private killings inside the home evolved into something far more sinister during the empire: punishment as public theater. It was no longer enough for a man to quietly dispose of a wife he accused of disobedience. Now the spectacle of her suffering became part of Rome's culture. One of the most terrifying examples was the punishment reserved for women accused of poisoning their husbands or plotting against the family. Instead of a swift execution, they were paraded through the streets, stripped of their dignity, and displayed before the very neighbors who had once smiled at them in the marketplace. This was humiliation as a weapon. To Romans, shaming the body was as important as destroying the life. But humiliation was often just the beginning. Some women were condemned to die in ways that mirrored the punishments of slaves and criminals, a deliberate attempt to strip them of all social status. They could be flogged in public, tied to stakes in the forum, and left for hours while insults rained down from the crowd. By the time the executioner struck the final blow, many were already broken in mind and spirit. One infamous case is preserved in the annals of Tacitus, who tells of women accused of adultery under Emperor Tiberius. Rather than being killed quietly, they were forced to endure elaborate trials where lurid details were exaggerated for maximum scandal. The men in power were not interested in truth. They wanted a performance, and the women's disgrace fed the political machine. When their sentences were carried out, it was often in ways designed to entertain the public. The Colosseum, most often remembered for gladiators and wild beasts, also became the stage for punishment specifically aimed at women. Some accounts speak of women accused of betraying their husbands being condemned to fight animals, naked, unarmed, and utterly defenseless. The image is haunting: a once respected matron thrown into the sand, reduced to a spectacle for jeering crowds. Whether every detail of these accounts is true or embellished, the fact that Romans could imagine and celebrate such scenarios reveals the depths of their cruelty. And then there was the punishment of burial alive, reserved for women accused of breaking sacred vows. Vestal virgins who lost their chastity were entombed beneath the earth, given just enough food and water to prolong their agony. While this was technically a religious punishment, its logic was the same. The woman's body was not her own. It belonged to Rome, and when she failed, Rome made sure her suffering was remembered. The brutality was not confined to the upper classes. Ordinary women who refused marriage or resisted control could be sold into slavery, a punishment worse than death. A freeborn Roman woman reduced to a slave was a living reminder of what happened when someone defied the system. She could be beaten, used, discarded, and there was no law to protect her. All of this reinforced the same chilling truth. Rome did not see women as individuals with rights, but as vessels of honor, property, and duty. When they stepped outside the boundaries of expectation, whether by refusing marriage, speaking too freely, or simply being inconvenient, they could be destroyed. And Rome celebrated it. The applause wasn't just metaphorical. Crowds actually cheered when these punishments unfolded, finding pleasure in the suffering of others. What made it worse was how ordinary it all seemed. This wasn't considered cruelty by Roman standards. It was justice, tradition, order. To live as a woman in Rome was to exist on borrowed time, never knowing when your role as wife, daughter, or mother could transform into the role of victim. But Rome's appetite for punishment was insatiable, and as emperors grew more paranoid and decadent, the violence only escalated. What began as private law and public shame would morph into punishments so grotesque, so calculated, that even ancient historians struggled to put them into words. The next chapter reveals these darkest depths, when women were not just punished, but turned into symbols of fear, their suffering immortalized as warnings to every other woman watching. Under the emperors, Rome's punishments for women took on a new, almost theatrical quality. These were no longer simple household disputes. They became matters of state, and the emperor himself decided who lived and who died. Women were no longer just private victims. They were now public warnings. Take Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. On the surface, Augustus was a champion of moral reform. He passed strict marriage laws, urging citizens to marry, have children, and strengthen the Roman family. But those laws came with teeth, and the teeth were sharp. Women who refused to marry or who had too few children could be fined, stripped of inheritance rights, or forced into unions they didn't want. What began as encouragement quickly became coercion. And when coercion failed, punishment followed. Even Augustus's own daughter, Julia, became a casualty of these laws. She was accused of adultery, but her real crime was defying the image of Roman womanhood her father wanted to impose. Instead of a quiet punishment, Augustus staged her downfall as a spectacle. Julia was exiled to a remote island, denied comfort, and left to waste away. The message was clear. If the emperor's own daughter could be punished like this, no woman was safe. By the reign of Tiberius, punishments became even more chilling. Trials of women accused of adultery, treason, or simply offending powerful men turned into elaborate performances. The charges were often exaggerated, sometimes fabricated, and the outcome was almost always death or exile. These trials weren't just about justice, they were about fear. Every woman watching was meant to see herself in the accused, to imagine her own body on trial. And then came Nero, the emperor who seemed to turn cruelty into an art form. Under Nero, women could be executed not just for crimes, but for being politically inconvenient. His own mother, Agrippina, was famously murdered. And while she was no innocent, her death was turned into a grotesque performance, with multiple failed assassination attempts before she was finally killed. Nero's own wife, Octavia, was exiled and executed on trumped-up charges of adultery, simply because Nero wanted to marry someone else. When these punishments were announced, the Roman people often applauded. Not because they believed the women guilty, many didn't tea, but because the theater of punishment was addictive. It was entertainment. The downfall of a noble woman was like a live drama, played out before the entire city. And every punishment reinforced the idea that the emperor's power was absolute, and that a woman's life, reputation, and body were his to control. This made resistance nearly impossible. A woman who refused marriage could not simply live quietly. Her refusal could be framed as an insult to the state, a disruption of Rome's moral order. That made her dangerous. And dangerous women had to be destroyed publicly as examples. But here's the most chilling part. Many women internalized this system. They saw their peers punished and told themselves, "I must obey, or this will be me." This wasn't just physical control, it was psychological warfare. Rome didn't just break women's bodies, it broke their spirits. And yet, despite the constant threat of punishment, there were women who defied the system, who refused to be silent, who dared to love who they wished, who fought back. Their stories, though rare, are some of the most harrowing in Roman history because the price they paid was so high. In the next part, we'll explore those women. Rebels, adulteresses, would-be assassins, and those who simply refused to marry at all. And we'll see how Rome crushed them, not just to punish them, but to send a message to every other woman who even thought about resisting. Among the women who stood against Rome's iron grip, their names are often half erased, surviving only as warnings in dusty legal records or scandalous histories. Yet their defiance was real, and the punishments they suffered were deliberately staged to terrify others. One of the most infamous examples comes from the reign of Augustus. A Roman matron named Clodia, accused of refusing to marry after the death of her first husband, took her case to the Senate, insisting she should not be forced into a second union. It was a daring move, and a fatal one. The Senate ruled against her, branding her as a corrupter of Roman morals. Her punishment was not quiet exile, but public humiliation. She was paraded through the forum, her hair cut off, her garments torn, while a crier shouted her crime for all to hear. The message was unmistakable. Rome would not allow women to choose solitude. Under later emperors, punishment became even more brutal. Women accused of avoiding marriage could be forced into unions with men far below their status, a punishment meant to degrade as much as to control. In some cases, they were ordered to marry convicted criminals, a living sentence designed to erase their honor. And for those who resisted even that, Rome's punishment could turn deadly. Some were flogged in public, a rare and shocking sentence for women. Others were banished to remote islands, their property seized, left to starve in isolation. Their deaths were slow, but the Senate made sure their names were remembered, not as martyrs, but as examples. Then there were the women who refused more than marriage, women who plotted against their own husbands or against the emperor. These cases turned into public spectacles, where punishment became a form of theater. Consider the case of Livilla, accused of plotting with her lover to poison Tiberius's son. Ancient writers say she was imprisoned in her own house and slowly starved to death under the watch of her own mother. Her execution was private, but her fate was public knowledge, and Roman citizens whispered that her punishment was worse than the sword. Even more chilling were the punishments staged in the arena. Though rare, there are accounts of women condemned for defying imperial decrees being thrown to wild animals in public games. These executions were not just about justice, they were entertainment, a living warning for every Roman woman watching from the stands: obey or face the beasts. Perhaps the most disturbing element was how the state turned the people into accomplices. The crowd often cheered these punishments. They saw the woman's destruction as a reaffirmation of Rome's order, as though every scream and every drop of blood restored some imagined moral balance. But in some cases, the crowd turned sympathetic, their cheers giving way to silence or even open protest. These moments terrified the Senate and the emperors, who feared the public might begin to pity the condemned. And so punishments became more carefully staged, more theatrical, designed not to evoke sympathy, but to reinforce fear. Each of these women, Clodia, Livilla, and countless nameless others, became part of Rome's dark tapestry, their suffering woven into the moral code that ruled the empire. They were turned into lessons, living cautionary tales for the women who still had choices to make. And that is where the true power of Rome's punishments lay, not just in killing or shaming, but in controlling the minds of those still living. The next part will reveal how these punishments evolved into a system so efficient that it nearly erased female rebellion altogether, until one shocking case shook the empire and forced Rome to question its own laws. As Rome's obsession with control deepened, its laws became less about justice and more about spectacle. The system was designed to make every act of defiance not just dangerous, but unthinkable. Women were no longer simply punished for refusing marriage. They were transformed into cautionary tales meant to haunt every dinner table conversation, every whispered talk between mothers and daughters. And then came the case that almost broke the system. The story begins with a young patrician woman named Junia, whose father had arranged for her to marry an influential senator twice her age. Junia refused, not once, not twice, but 3 times, openly and defiantly. She declared she would never marry him, citing not religion, not illness, but personal choice. A scandalous act of rebellion in a society that did not believe women had such a right. Her refusal embarrassed her entire family. It was seen as a personal insult to the Senate itself. The case went public, and Rome turned it into a spectacle. Pamphlets were distributed describing her defiance. The people whispered about her in the baths, in the marketplaces. The emperor's advisors feared this act of rebellion could spread, that other young women might follow Junia's example. So Rome made an example of her, Junia was dragged before a tribunal. Witnesses were called to testify to her refusal. Her own father was forced to denounce her in public, declaring that she had betrayed the family's honor. When the verdict came, it was harsher than anyone had imagined. She was sentenced to be stripped of her dowry, flogged publicly, and forced into marriage with a man chosen by the state. But Junia did something no one expected. She resisted, violently. Ancient sources say she spat on the magistrate who read her sentence, that she screamed curses at the Senate, and that she tried to escape before her flogging could take place. What happened next was unprecedented. The crowd rioted. Ordinary Romans, who had gathered to watch her punishment as a kind of grim entertainment, turned on the guards. Some shouted that Junia was brave, that she was standing up to tyranny. Others booed the magistrates, forcing them to stop the spectacle. Rome was shaken. Punishments were meant to restore order, not cause riots. For the first time, the Senate debated whether its laws had gone too far. Was forcing women to marry, even under threat of death, truly Roman justice, or had it become a tool of cruelty? The emperor himself had to intervene. Historical accounts suggest that Junia's punishment was quietly commuted. She was exiled instead of forced to marry, her flogging cancelled. It was a rare concession, but it came at a price. To make sure no one saw this as a victory, Rome flooded the streets with propaganda, blaming Junia's case on excessive clemency, and warning that future rebels would be dealt with more severely. But the damage was done. Junia had become a legend. Stories about her circulated for years, some painting her as a martyr, others as a cautionary tale. But one thing was certain: she had cracked the facade of Roman power. For the first time, the people had seen that Rome could be challenged. This moment set the stage for an even darker chapter, one where the empire doubled down on its cruelty, creating punishments so horrifying that they would be whispered about for centuries after the fall of Rome. After Junia's case, the Senate learned a dangerous lesson. Public sympathy could turn punishment into protest, and Rome was never a city that tolerated rebellion lightly. So, instead of softening, the system became even more ruthless. If one woman's defiance could inspire riots, then the state would make the next defiant woman's fate so horrifying that no one would dare cheer for her again. The penalties grew darker, more theatrical. Refusing marriage was no longer just a family matter. It became a crime against the state. Women who resisted were stripped of their citizenship rights, branded on their foreheads with heated iron, and paraded through the streets as examples of disobedience. Some were confined in underground chambers until they agreed to marry. Others were forced into state-controlled marriages with violent, abusive men. Their suffering meant to be a living warning. One particularly brutal account describes a young woman named Aelia, who was not just flogged, but chained to the doors of the Senate itself for an entire day, her body displayed as a living message to every passerby. When she finally collapsed, her body was dragged through the forum and buried outside the city walls, a burial reserved for criminals. It was Rome's way of declaring that refusing marriage was equivalent to treason. But even this cruelty had an unintended effect. Roman writers of the time began to question whether this obsession with control was a sign of strength or weakness. Was an empire truly mighty if it had to terrorize its own women into obedience? Some philosophers compared these laws to slavery, warning that Rome was destroying the very virtue it claimed to uphold. And yet, the laws persisted for centuries. Even as the empire shifted from republic to imperial rule, the principle remained. A woman's refusal to marry was not a personal decision. It was an insult to Rome itself. This obsession with control would eventually become part of the empire's undoing. As Christianity spread, offering women an alternative path through religious devotion, more and more chose celibacy over forced marriage. The state responded with harsher punishments, confiscating property, imprisoning virgins, even executing some who refused to abandon their vows. Each act of repression drove more sympathy to the Christian cause, further eroding Rome's power over its citizens. By the late empire, these laws had become relics of a crumbling system, desperate attempts to hold on to a world that was slipping away. The same iron fist that once kept Rome united became the symbol of its brutality, remembered not for its justice, but for its cruelty. And so when we speak of Rome today, we often marvel at its architecture, its roads, its military genius. But behind the marble and the glory lay stories like these. Stories of women who were forced to choose between obedience and death, of fathers who were ordered to betray their daughters, of laws so harsh that they turned families into weapons of the state. Perhaps that is the real tragedy of Rome, not just that it punished those who rebelled, but that it demanded they suffer in public, turning private pain into public theater. And maybe that's why this chapter of history was so often left out of the classroom. Because once you learn how far Rome would go to control even the most intimate parts of its citizens' lives, you begin to see its greatness in a different light, not just as an empire of law, but as an empire of fear.